Hey guys, Pascal here. We had another live show this week. Erin and Luke were joined by Dawn Kinder and Carl Segerstrom. Dawn is the Director of Housing and Human Services for the City of Spokane, and Carl is the Communications and Storytelling Manager for Waters Meet. The four of them talked about housing insecurity, the impacts of homelessness, and how Spokane is fighting against it. You can find relevant articles, other podcast episodes, and more on our website, rangemedia.co. Thanks for listening, and on to the show.
Two guests today talking roughly about housing homelessness, housing insecurity, and how well we're sort of fighting back from our housing crisis. Who are we chatting with today?
Yeah, today we're here with Dawn Kinder. Want to say hi and give your official title?
Sure. My name's Dawn Kinder, and I'm the Director of Housing and Human Services for the City of Spokane.
Awesome. And in the second half of the show, we're going to be talking to Carl Segerstrom of Waters Meet Foundation. And if that name sounds familiar, that he is a past colleague of ours at Range Media. We'll be hearing from him in the second half. So,
yeah, in the first half, we're hoping to talk about longitudinal systems analysis data. I have to sit through every Monday. There's a committee meeting with the Spokane City Council. Usually those can be, no offense, kind of long and boring. But this week, there was some really interesting data that Dawn came to present to the committee on, which are kind of the preliminary findings from the 2025 longitudinal systems analysis, which is a really long way to say that it's kind of a study that looks comprehensively at the city's entries and exits to homelessness programs over the course of the year. Is that an okay layman's definition? Is there another way that you guys talk about it?
No, I think that's very accurate. It kind of covers our 5 of our largest intervention types, and is submitted annually to HUD.
Okay. Yeah. So I think most people, it wouldn't surprise me, I guess, if most listeners to this would maybe have been more familiar, if they're familiar with any of these things at all, with the point in time count, which is also like literally happening right now. I
sure
believe.
Is.
So just level set, can we get a primer on what LSA is, the longitudinal systems analysis versus point in time count? What does each survey collect? What are they both trying to do? And just so that people understand the difference.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring that up, Luke. It's a huge difference. And folks are really familiar with the PIT. It's very public. It gets a lot of attention, and which is great, right? We get a huge volunteer turnout and a lot of interest in it. The PIT is a once-a-year snapshot required by the federal government. They tell us when in the year we can do it, what we have to collect, and it's really just a survey of both sheltered and unsheltered individuals. For the purposes of the PIT, that does include transitional housing. Right. In Spokane, that's a fairly small number of units. Okay. And that's a really quick basic demographics and a little bit of context on an individual's experience related to their homelessness. Okay. We use that data to look at major trends over longer periods of time, but it does not give us really detailed ideas about where there's gaps, what's failing, what's working, where we've seen pivots be impactful or not impactful. It's really kind of a snapshot of what's happening on the street on a literal week in January. Yep. The longitudinal systems analysis is a very thorough report. It covers 5 interventions, which includes all of our emergency shelter, transitional housing, rapid rehousing with or without services, and then our permanent supportive housing as well, which most people understand that in terms of permanent housing for folks in projects like Donna Hanson Haven, Hope House, etc.
Right.
How long have you guys been doing the longitudinal systems analysis?
This actually came up earlier today with a different outlet. The LSA has been going on for a very long time. The pivot that happened about 2 years ago is HUD created a tool that allowed us to actually extract that into publicly digestible data.
Interesting. Okay.
So historically, it had been this massive HGX file that unless you were like an IT analyst.
Unless you knew what an HGX file is, which I do not.
Yes, you wouldn't be able to. Yeah, you'd get it and be like, this is not helpful at all. Right. So HUD actually implemented a new tool 2 years ago that allowed us to upload that report into the HUD system, and then what we can pull out of it is this actual publicly digestible narrative with tables and graphs that make it really easy to understand what's happening. So it was very exciting for us to be able to make that public for the first time a couple years ago. But the data does exist pre that. It's just in a very complicated format.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. And it does look, to your point, Luke, it looks at like every single possible outcome of an individual moving through those systems. So it's a far more in-depth actual, the PIT is kind of like an output.
Yeah.
And the LSA is really about outcomes.
Yeah.
That's a good way of putting it.
Interesting.
Okay. So what we're kind of like, I mean, we've got this table, these high level findings.
Yeah.
Obviously, people who are listening to the radio can't look at the same pretty table we're looking at. So can you walk us through some of these like high level preliminary findings that have been seemingly like an indicator of some positive momentum for homelessness services?
Yeah, well, and maybe specifically to start, I remember the stat that came out of the LSA that was so, especially given a lot of just the conversation around downtown and the visibly homeless, massively suffering folks that are downtown, was that in 2024, the number of individuals served was 7,200. When I think that, when we're focused on like sort of visibly homeless downtown, that's like maybe a couple hundred people or maybe 100 people. And so that the number was just so astronomical, or just so much different than like all the conversations we've been having about downtown. That really stood out to me. And then the data point from 2025 so maybe talking about what that all means, like why that number is so much bigger than, what people might be experiencing downtown. And then the fact that number went down to 6,430 or about an 11% drop this year.
Yeah, I love that you bring that up, because I think we get the most questions about visible homelessness, particularly in the downtown core. And it's a very small fraction of the actual body of work that our division is managing in partnership with groups like Waters Meet. So, that number is really large if you stop and think about it, compared to your point, like to the 100 people that are really visible downtown who absolutely need support too. We think the decrease in between 24 and 25 had a lot to do with our shift in homeless prevention. So one of the things that the LSA does not include is our data points around homeless prevention, which for Spokane is particularly rooted in eviction prevention funds. And we made some pretty pivotal shifts during the Brown administration in terms of how we administer those funds, how we kind of monitor performance or spend down of those funds to ensure they're actually getting out into the community, and made some pretty significant shifts midway in 2025. So we really think that a lot of that decrease is attributed to a far better administration of eviction prevention funds, which is stopping people from entering the homeless system. Not necessarily that there's that fewer people in need, but that we're doing a better job getting to them at the right time. And so they're not entering homelessness in the first place, which to me is like, you want to nerd out on data. Like, that's a pretty incredible thing.
An ounce of prevention versus a pound of cure, whatever that is.
Yes, exactly. Like if we can stop you from becoming homeless, the long-term success of that household is far improved. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I'm curious because I've been looking at the new like eviction prevention ordinance that council is looking at. I know that's like a bit of a digression, but is that kind of hoping to like operationalize some of these changes more or push those forward? The kind of like, how do you guys see it from the admin side?
It's interesting. So all of our eviction prevention funds currently come from the Washington State Department of Commerce. It's a fairly robust amount of funds for the region. The county receives funding as well. And the ordinance that's being proposed by council generally aligns with the work that we're contracted to do with Commerce. It puts some different responsibilities on landlords locally than Commerce requires of anyone. I think we see our role in that ordinance, should it pass, to really be focused on landlord engagement and helping landlords understand where they can direct somebody if they're facing eviction purely based on lack of payment, right? If someone's being evicted for bad behavior or some other instance, this ordinance is not really designed to apply. But if you're evicting somebody purely out of lack of ability to pay, that's where a landlord should be working with us to say, hey, we've got funds that can help stop that eviction, which one eviction makes you far more likely to experience a whole lot of other challenges, right? So in that frame, I really appreciate what council is trying to accomplish. We want to stop evictions, especially those that are solely based on payment.
Right. I mean, I'm glad we're having the conversation. This is a thing. Maybe we should just turn Carl's mic on here because one of the things that I remember talking about a little bit when we spent so much time focused on Camp Hope out on, East, what was that, on 2nd or 3rd, by the Fred
freeway.
Meyer out there.
Yeah.
Was that was where, and again, I'm not saying that WSDOT created our housing crisis, but like that's where a lot of people, including families I know, had been displaced for this north-south freeway. And we were thinking, like, we even pulled some data that we never ended up reporting on about, like, if there are like 500 people camping at Camp Hope, how many houses got torn down for this freeway? And not to make a one-to-one comparison, but like, it's just shocking to me how infrequently when we're talking about homelessness, we also talk about housing.
Yes.
And like, can we please just try to make some connection between those two?
Yeah. It would be helpful for sure. Yeah. And you know, the challenges around development too is a critical part of that, right?
Yeah.
Like we're losing housing stock and it is difficult to develop it.
Yeah. Yeah. Things are a lot more expensive than they used to be built. Yeah. So there's also an increase in percent of individuals exiting to permanent housing. And so permanent housing in that second sort of data frame, that includes permanent supportive housing, or is that just...
Yep, that includes any permanent housing option.
So basically out of a shelter or out of being unsheltered into something like a haven or a permanent house?
Or like out of a TH project into kind of a... Okay. When we define...
What's a TH project?
Sorry, transitional housing. Okay. It's like a catalyst style project.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. And those permanent housing units are typically things that have some form of city or government subsidy in them, that also include a service component.
Like a case manager or something.
You might have an on-site healthcare, behavioral health case manager also associated with your housing access. Yeah. And we're super excited about the increase we see there. I think, one thing that we've pushed really hard since Mayor Brown came into office, is that we can't emergency shelter our way out of this crisis. Right. We have to have housing, to your point earlier, Luke, for folks to actually move into. Mm-hmm. Expecting shelter to solve homelessness is kind of like expecting the emergency department to solve cancer. Like, that's just not how it works. Yeah. Shelter is a life safety measure. Mm-hmm. It's not a cure for the problem. And so what we're excited about with those increases, both in bullet point 2 and 3 really, is that we're seeing folks go straight from either a shelter or non-permanent housing placement into real housing. And what that means to us is that now a shelter bed's open. Right. Every time we see somebody move out of shelter into a permanent housing placement, it means there's a shelter bed open, so somebody literally in crisis has a place to go. And that is what the system is actually designed to do, is to have that flow. And our partners have been incredible about rising to the occasion, and we have asked a lot of them without necessarily bringing new resources to the table in some cases, to really pay attention to that and prioritize those folks who they know are ready for the next thing, and then prioritize the folks who they know need more services first, and be super intentional about making quality referrals, not just any referral.
Right. Yeah, I know when we were doing reporting on like the Trent shelter, which was more of a congregational facility, a lot of the complaints was that there wasn't any movement out of the facility unless somebody was like getting kicked out. Like there wasn't really a smooth way to exit the Trent shelter into housing. And I know you guys have switched, like for folks who are less familiar with this conversation, the city has switched from that congregational model to what you guys are calling like a hub and spoke model. Yeah. Can you maybe outline what you guys see as the key differences between those two systems?
Yeah, and I think, Carl, another good reason to unmute him, but Watersmeet was super involved in that too. But I think our philosophy coming in was, there's always a place for some version of congregate shelter in our community, because there has to be that safety net.
That like low barrier.
Yeah,
you
that
can
like
walk in the door
I can just walk in and get a meal and a bed and feel safe. That has to exist. However, an overabundance of that, to your point, Erin, does not move the needle. And so the idea was that we know that congregate shelter, especially at the scale that the track center was set up to be, we're not seeing any success there, right? The placement numbers coming out of that facility were sad. And that's not a critique on the provider. It's just not, the model is not successful. Yeah. And our intent was to really pivot and focus both on relationship building, because people heal in the context of relationships just like we do. Yeah. And to also understand that there's certain populations that need safe spaces separate from one another to feel like they're really able to relax enough to focus on something besides survival. Right. early in the Brown administration, we had some great conversations with some faith-based leaders who were acknowledging that they had underutilized space with the changes in church activity. And so we kind of thought, hey, how do we bridge these gaps to meet local needs of smaller groups of folks who are unhoused, and also partner with kind of a mission-aligned organization who's got space they're willing to kind of lend to this use and create some really meaningful new partnerships. We brought Waters Meat to the table to really help with that. The city is not always the best facilitator, as you all know. And we were able to build some really positive relationships between faith-based communities and local nonprofits to co-locate services inside churches. Obviously, not all of those scattered sites are within a faith-based building. But the idea really is to say, okay, if we've got this location for folks just in recovery, right? We hear a lot about fentanyl and opioid use in this community, rightfully so. Try and stay clean in a shelter with 100 people who are also using.
Yeah.
Like, what are we are asking people to do the impossible.
And something that might be closer to downtown or closer to sort of like natural migration patterns where like a drug dealer might set up because there's a lot of people there.
They know who's here. Yeah. And so it was really intentional around, we need to create safe spaces for certain populations. We need to decrease the volume to create meaningful relationship. And we need the community to come with us. Government cannot solve this. We'd love to be part of it, but we cannot be all of it. And so who in the community is willing to come with us? And we were lucky that Waters Meat and Jules Helping Hands and Cat and many others raised their hands.
So the one other question kind of in the NIMBY conversation was around like these the scatter site model where it's like, okay, there's going to be 10 or 20 or 30 people up at, Morning Star Baptist up in the northwest part of town, and you're unmuted, Carl, so feel free to chime in here too if you got an answer. Like one of the things I was obviously whenever any talk of any sort of sheltering situation comes up in in a neighborhood, we get the NIMBY conversation. I was wondering at the beginning of this year when this all was announced, or late last year, I guess we're in a new year, so maybe late 2 years ago. Jeez.
Time's flying.
A little rusty with calendar stuff too today, guys. Like how much, and maybe you can't kind of make some sort of clear distinction, but these are not new stand-up shelters. Maybe it's because of the faith-based nature of it, or maybe it's just because these have been sort of community institutions in these neighborhoods. Did you see that defraying maybe a little bit of the criticism at the outset? And then how have you guys been feeling about how have the neighborhoods responded to having these scatter shelters in their neighborhood? Yeah,
feel free to chime in too. I think there's a couple of things at play. I think we certainly saw both the involvement of Waters Meat, then EHF, and the faith-based community help to neutralize some of the fear. I think people have a natural, at this point especially, distrust of government. And as honest as we are in my work, it's helpful to have partners who also have a different relationship with the community come to the table. So I think that certainly helped. I think for the most part, it's gone really well. We do certainly get calls occasionally from folks around concerns with the neighborhood. And certainly there's kind of this very predictable timeline of like you announce a new site, everybody goes, oh my God. And then the site opens and then like 2 months later, you never hear about it again. And I think the reality is, and not to totally soapbox here, but we've just created a level of fear around unhoused people that has become so political. And it's really unfortunate because we don't see it proven true. And so I think for those of us in the field, it's like, oh, I know this arc. There's going to be a panic. There's going to be a loud boom. And then it's going to operate for a little while and folks are going to go, oh, okay, I'm still safe actually. And so I think we've just learned to live with that curve. And I think there's also real truth in having other community partners coming with us and helping, dispel misinformation, to provide a different level of comfort and trust. And our providers have been really willing to go out and meet with folks. We've been they are at neighborhood council meetings. Somebody calls, they go talk to them. They meet with nearby businesses. We've put in the good neighbor agreements, obviously. So I think we've also got partners who are willing to go talk to you. It's okay to disagree. Let's have a conversation about it. And that goes a long way.
Did you have anything to add to that, Carl?
Yeah, I would just say I think we learned a lot over the last year and a half about what makes it successful to bring one of these scattered sites into a neighborhood. And so much of that is that advanced consultation and that ability to meet with the community beforehand and to level set. And also I think a lot of credit goes to the service providers who do really cool stuff. Like they'll set up a block or few block radius around their shelter and go pick up trash on a weekly basis. So there's a really important aspect there of the people who are doing the work and supporting the community, also recognizing that they're part of that community now and giving back to it.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, I know looking at this chart, we saw, Luke described the big jump of individuals exiting to permanent housing. There's also that line on the bottom that says percentage of individuals exiting permanent supportive housing to permanent housing. Yeah. Can you talk me through that statistic?
Yeah,
because it can get a little jargony.
It's my personal favorite, so I'm glad you called it out, Erin. So when we, in this context, what we're talking about is people leaving a unit that has a subsidy or service component attached to true independent housing. And pre-COVID, there was a lot of momentum around something called the move-on strategy, which was really focused on trying to move people out of subsidized housing who no longer needed it because they had reached a level of stability and income where they could afford either a market rate unit, a workforce unit, or an AMI controlled unit, but no longer needed on-site services and really, really low rent payments. COVID kind of stalled that momentum for obvious reasons. When we came into office, we really brought that back pretty hard with our housing providers of hey, if you've got folks in units who we know can succeed at the next stage, we've got to help them get there because we cannot build enough housing to deal with this at the PSH level. Not everybody's going to get a PSH unit who's homeless. So providers have been really intentional about helping individuals who are stably housed in a subsidized, wrapped around unit say, you're ready. You're ready, you've got this. We're going to help you find the next place. We'll still support you, right? Call us if you need us. This is not a goodbye forever. But there's somebody in the shelter who needs this unit right now, and you've progressed enough that you can do this, which is a massive lift if you think about it. And the providers heard that. And they've been working really hard on that, our continuum of care, and they've got 5 subcommittees and 4 subcommittees of that. I mean, it's nuts. But that group has been working really hard on move-on strategies, similar to the first point of we have to stem the flow and then also help people exit at the end. They cannot permanently be in the system and allow us to serve everyone. So it's really helping folks who are living in Donna, living in Hope House, find their next unit where they might still have a voucher attached. It might still have an income limit on it, but they're no longer needing permanent services to sustain that unit. And what that means then is that there's space in the system for more folks to progress through, which is exactly what we want to see, is that ebb and flow in the system. So that's a huge piece for us.
So besides just sort of rallying the troops and saying, hey, we need to help this move on thing happen, was there changes to policy or process that helped, or is it just having those committees where people can kind of...
I think it's committees. I mean, I think, at the risk of sounding super social worky and cheesy, I think amongst many things, COVID also just killed collaboration locally. I think people had to become siloed, right? Everybody went into survival mode. Our field, probably much like yours, only accelerated during COVID. People were going home and we were never going home. And so, I think we just had people dig in. And so, and the city at the time had stopped facilitating community meetings. There weren't monthly conversations with shelter providers or outreach providers to do this kind of coordinated work. We've been really intentional, and Waters Meet's been hosting meetings as well to bring the providers back together really frequently and regularly in large and small groups to talk about how this work can be improved upon. And the city has made some substantial changes in how we use money, and I think that is certainly part of this. We have taken a lot of provider feedback in terms of places where we do have flexibility, and we've. This is going to sound a bit bureaucratic, but we've also incentivized partners to some extent, because if someone's got a contract with us to do X, Y, and Z, and they're not doing X, Y, and Z for whatever reason. Maybe the community need has changed, whatever it is. We're recapturing those funds back and reallocating them to projects that are working. So the idea here, too, is that the community needs shift and change over time. Money has to follow the need. So simply funding the same contract over and over, if it's not producing anything, we shouldn't be doing it. And the providers agree with that. And we have had several really large reallocations of funds away from one provider towards another one, based on where we're seeing success, where we're seeing subpopulations needs surge, and what we're seeing in terms of outcomes. And that has also, I think, really motivated partners to see that, hey, if you're doing the good work, if you're making these outcomes possible, we're going to find more resources to keep you going. I think that's absolutely absolutely helped too.
I know one of the things that Carl reported on quite a bit under the Woodward administration, and I think I caught the tail end of that after you moved on from this field, was staffing stability. And I saw it get brought up. Family Promise hosted like an Ask Me Anything on Reddit about homelessness and services being provided. And they said that one of the big positive differences that they'd noticed in the city was like just a consistency of staffing levels and like that consistency kind of contributing to more effective relationships. And I know like that's maybe a little bit like how the sausage gets made too much, but I am kind of curious, like what have the staffing levels been like
we're crushing it. I mean, I think honestly, like I think what's really, really cool, and it's true. I mean, I was in the field during the Woodward administration. The city was in a constant state of turnover. They were never fully staffed. The staff who were there were clearly pulled in too many directions. It was really hard to get responses from leadership. And the city is, whether people like it or not, the facilitating body of a lot of money, which means that we are absolutely integral to the success of the projects. It does not mean we're doing the work, but if we're not doing good, our providers can't possibly be expected to do good. And I love direct service. I did it for many years in Seattle. I've done it for many years here. Our only job, we are customer service to nonprofits. That's our job. Like that is the job. Our job is to be good customer service support, technical assistance for agencies doing really hard day in, day out work. And I've been incredibly lucky that Ariel Anderson was willing to come join me at the city shortly after I came in. She's incredible. We've built a really strong team. When I started, I think maybe we had like 7 staff on a 28-person team. There were days where I was like, what did I just do? Oh my God. We've got very, very low turnover. I think we've had one person leave since I started. We've had like a few retirements. I mean, there was some major turnover at the beginning. There was some, I was a different person coming in. Some of the staff who were still there were not a big fan of mine. That's totally fine. We've built a really good team. Since Ariel and I got in there, we've had one or two people leave for great opportunities. But the team is super stable. They work incredibly hard. They are very well supported. My only job is to make sure their jobs are easier. Cool. And that I do think that matters. Yeah.
We've got you for 4 more minutes before you've got to skedaddle.
Oh, wow,
so
yeah,
I guess I was
fine.
curious if you wanted to leave people with like any kind of high level takeaway or anything that you hope people understand about either data collection on this kind of like data and how we're measuring things, or what the city's looking forward to, that's momentum, like any sort of high level takeaways you want to give us in your last couple minutes.
Yes, I think there's a couple of things, and I'll try and be brief, which is not my strength. We take data really seriously. I think this field in general for a long time was not paying a lot of attention to data. In the last 10, 15 years, that has certainly changed, and we are taking it incredibly seriously because we cannot make informed decisions if we don't know what's happening on the ground. The reality is I'm not a service provider, and neither are my staff. So we have to be looking at the information our providers are giving us to make informed choices. A lot of the changes that we've made in these 2 years have been based on data. We review it constantly. We've really changed data transparency. We do quarterly performance reports to council, obviously, but also have an agreement with the Spokane Regional Health District. They host all of our data publicly.
Oh, wow.
It's completely manipulatable. You can go in on a quarterly basis, and there's brand new data based on performance for each project. We want the community to go interact with that and ask us questions. And then we use that data really frequently. Like I said, we reallocate funds based on it. We've put agencies on performance plans based on it. And it's not for the sake of being punitive, but because our end user is the person on the street tonight.
Yeah.
And if we're not using that data to make better decisions for that individual, what the hell are we doing?
Yeah.
And so we care deeply about that. And I think a lot of people question the validity of it. And I think our data is federally mandated. It is governed by federal data compliance and quality standards on top of state data quality and compliance standards. We are managing all of that with a very small team of people, and we've reduced, the first LSA we submitted, which was for the administration before us, HUD gave us 160 red flags for data quality.
No.
And we were like, oh my God, this is not good. This year when we submitted it, we started with 52 flags and got it down to 26, which is a 67.5% improvement in data quality. Yeah. We take it there's no reason for people to trust what we're saying if we can't back it up with numbers.
Yeah.
And I believe that, and so does the team. So it's integral to the work, and we're going to keep pushing it.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right, everyone. That was Dawn Kinder on the
Thank you.
longitudinal systems analysis. We have our key indicators. When can we expect the final data from
Yeah,
that?
so our plan is to present to council late February, early March on the full report, just like we did last year, which will give a lot of additional detail, as well as dive into subpopulations. And then we'll also be presenting to the BOCC and the Spokane Valley City Council in March as well.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. All right, we're going to go to a short break for underwriter and promo announcements, and then we're going to be back with Carl Segerstrom from Waters Meet.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right, everybody, we're back with Free Range, and we're here in the studio with Carl Segerstrom from Waters Meet. I know you as our former City Hall reporter, but you have a different job title now. Do you want to tell us what that is?
Yeah, I am the communications and storytelling manager for Waters Meet Foundation and Action Fund.
Wow, cool.
And so Waters Meet is a 501c3 sort of traditional nonprofit. The Action Fund is a C4, and that which allows a nonprofit to do a little bit more advocacy type work. And do you live more on kind of equally on both sides of the ball, or where do you spend most of your time?
I spend most of my time on the foundation side.
Okay.
We have a larger endowment. We have more of like programmatic work on the foundation side, but I also split my time with the Action Fund and doing the communications on that side as well.
Cool. And we're here with Carl because Waters Meet just put out a report. You guys were the kind of service provider or like leads of the navigation center for the last year, and then you guys stopped in the fall.
Yeah, so that contract ran from October 2024 to September 2025. And we were the main contractor with the city. We don't provide any direct service. So we subcontracted with all of the service providers throughout the system and then provided some like back office support to them, stuff like prepayment of contracts and getting all of the billing done in time and stuff like that. Just kind of the nuts and bolts that we as a larger institution are able to support the folks who are doing the most important work on the ground every day.
Okay. And so what did that look like? You guys are based out of the old Cannon shelter for a while, right? And then like in partnership with Revive, kind of doing that more hands-on service provider type work?
Yeah, so we never have any we never had any staff who are actually like in the shelter environment on a day-to-day basis. Revive was running the Cannon Street shelter during this time.
Okay.
And so they were serving as the lead of the Housing Navigation Center and also running a 30-bed shelter at the same time that they were running a navigation center, which proved to be a big challenge. And just because navigation centers in general are meant to be day centers, and now the navigation center is a day center, but that combination of a shelter environment and a navigation center is a really big challenge when you're a low barrier shelter, but you're also trying to get people moved on into housing.
Yeah.
Okay. And so this was a 12-month pilot project.
Mm-hmm.
Now we've got some data, some high-level recommendations that come out of your guys' experience with the work. Do you want to talk us through some of that? Or like, what was it like to be in this role for a year?
I think it was a really important learning opportunity. And I think that was really the approach across the community of providers and from the city of Spokane. Like, this was a pilot project by nature, and we learned and made adjustments, and the city CHHS department, Community Housing and Human Services department, made those adjustments throughout the program. So, for instance, like, we needed more coordination among the outreach team. We have teams. There's a bunch out there.
Yeah.
They kind of operated in different lanes. They're more coordinated now.
And so those are the folks that are making like first contact with people on the streets or experiencing homelessness.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. We also realized like a daytime navigation center that's not also a shelter is the right model, and it's the model that other communities have, and it's the model that's been adopted now.
Okay.
And there's also a desire to have a tiny home village, and that's something that we're currently in progress on trying to stand up. So I think what was really important, and Dawn mentioned this earlier, is the spirit of collaboration between decision makers of the city, but also among service providers. So we were hosting twice monthly meetings and continue to host these twice monthly meetings for the time being to really bring folks to the table and say, what are you seeing? What are the gaps? How do we come together to create solutions? And it was really amazing to be in those rooms. I wasn't in every meeting, but especially early on, and just one, to see all these people comparing notes who are out there in the field every day having these experiences, also joined by local political leaders, local administration leaders, and local police to be like, yeah, we're seeing that. How can we address this? So there's that real-time information sharing and problem solving that was going on that I think it was really one of the most powerful spaces. And what was crazy to hear was that hadn't been happening on a regular basis in the community. And Dawn alluded to this earlier. There wasn't a set meeting for folks that it had been like maybe a decade that a lot of them were together in the same room talking about these problems and making those solutions. So I think that's like one of the lasting, really important things that we need to keep spinning into the forward is all of these different organizations who have different perspectives because they're serving different populations, getting together, collaborating, working towards problems together, working towards solutions together.
Yeah.
You've talked a little bit about siloing and kind of the limitations of both trying to run a daytime navigation center and that like low barrier nighttime emergency shelter. What were some of the other gaps or problems with the system that you guys identified and are like maybe walking through in this very lengthy report?
So I'm glad you said it earlier, but it's affordable housing. You can't expect the shelter system to bear the brunt of our local housing crisis. And people often think it's like this fail-safe that you can just be like, oh, well, people can find shelter on any given night because they'll go into the shelters. Shelters are an emergency response. They're not a long-term response. And because we haven't had that kind of release valve on the other end of people moving through the system from emergency shelter to that permanent supportive housing to affordable housing, people get stuck. People end up living for a year in Hope House or something like that. I remember hearing some testimony to that. It's just like there isn't a next place to go. Then that's where you're going to stay because that's where you've built community and that's where you feel safe.
Totally.
And it's really hard, and especially we talk about a bit in those meetings, like the changing face of homelessness. We have a lot of elderly people, and it's really hard to rebuild or find community if you don't if you're going from living with people who you know and have come to trust in the shelter environment to living alone in an apartment, that's just not really feasible for a lot of people. So finding those next steps that also continue that community component is really important.
Real quick, these terms that we use, like permanent supportive housing, things like Hope House, like the Booter Haven and the other Catholic Charities Haven, permanent insofar as as long as the person needs it, that space is there for them, but they're not intended to be forever necessarily. The idea is not
some of them have set times, you can be here for a year, but it's obviously a more permanent solution than
more permanent than a shelter, but not intended to be, unless something extraordinary were to happen. That's not intended to be somebody's forever home. It's just to be there for as long as they need it, and they need wraparound services. They need these other things. That's correct.
Less temporary than temporary supportive housing or transitional housing.
Quasi-permanent supportive housing. That is what
I can't walk you through exactly what each one of those things means.
Because each provider kind of does different things too, right? Or has slightly different standards.
There's coding at the city about what a different project is, but I'm not an expert on that.
Right. Is one of the questions I remember when you were reporting with us, Carl, that we just never knew was how many of those, families who might have been living out of their car, on the street next to Camp Hope or whatever, might eventually sort of take a shelter bed that might have gone. It was just the question of how much of this visible homelessness are we seeing is an uptick, or the difference between how much worse fentanyl is than some other kind of drug, or how much more sort of mental health problems there might be versus there's
How
just
much
so
more
many
rent
more
burdened are people?
so many more people are more rent burdened, and if you're only if this is your first night on the street, your maybe the capacity you have to find shelter or something and take up one of those beds that Don was talking about, being so precious at the like survival level of homelessness. Like, I don't know that we have any data for that, but it really feels like what you're saying is sort of bearing out a thing I think you and I talked about or over across the desk a number of times, like how much of what we're experiencing right now in the middle of COVID is how much worse fentanyl is than other things, or how much worse other thing, whatever. And how much of it is just that everybody is so much more housing constrained, and there might be, before we had this LSA data, like there might just be a lot more people experiencing homelessness, and that might just be overloading the system.
Yeah, I think the area that I've seen the most depressing data is when you look at the school districts. The school districts have that housing insecurity data, and it blows the rest of the data out of the water as to how many folks are doubled up, housing insecure, living in their living in a car, living couch surfing from house to house, living in someone's garage. Like that, those are the places where you really see like the full depth of the problem, and with such a vulnerable situation with young families.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at the current shelter capacity for the navigational, the hub and spoke navigational system, and there are not a ton of beds specifically designated for families with children. 15 beds at Family Promise is what's funded by the city. That's not to say that's the only shelter that's available. Sorry, I'm looking at page 11 on the report.
Okay, so that would be the Family Promise has its own shelter that was already operating, that wasn't part necessarily of the of the specialized shelter model. So that was 15 additional beds that they were able to open through. So I don't know the entirety of the contract status of Family Promise, so I can't speak to that. But I can say that through this model, they were able to reopen one of the houses that they had previously opened with funding from this bucket. So they were able to re-expand into a house where they could house 15 people.
Okay, cool. And I guess another thing that's tangentially related, kind of what Luke was talking about. I've been looking at eviction data and talking to Hannah Swenson at the KCBA Housing Justice Project's Spokane branch, and she was talking about looking at default evictions, which is basically an eviction where you don't find a lawyer in time or don't respond to paperwork, and so the courts just they can just evict you without a hearing, and kind of looking at the outcomes of if somebody gets default evicted, what are the odds they end up in a new house, and what are the odds that they end up on the streets. And that's data that they're trying to collect and clean up by looking at all the default evictions from 2025. I guess I'm particularly curious because it seems like there's a real appetite now to talk about housing and that end of the cycle instead of just public drug use, which has been such a focus of the news cycle and the political campaigns. How are you guys kind of where do you land on that conversation? What are you advocating for? Is there any, you mentioned housing as a solution. Is there any kind of recommendations in this report that play into that?
I think the thing that we recognize most in this report that would play into that is the need for a strong regional leadership structure and integrated systems. It's easy to figure out how many shelter beds there are in Spokane. It's not that easy, but if you can figure it out, I trust me. But knowing how many mental health treatment beds, knowing how many substance abuse beds are available in the community on any given day, on any given night, that's really challenging. So being able to bring that bigger picture of the spectrum of services that people need is something that our community really needs and is crying out for. Just knowing where you can go if you're experiencing a mental health crisis, or where you're going to have to wait 3 days where you're going to have to fill out paperwork and get on a wait list. Like that, the challenges of navigating somebody into those systems is really difficult. And I think we have folks who do a really good job on it, but it's like some of that is like an individual who just has enough relationships that they're able to do that, as opposed to a system that is able to integrate across these different needs that folks might have in a given moment.
I was just talking to somebody about my ride along with the behavioral unit in the fire department, and how honestly in some ways it seemed like the main role of the caseworker that goes out with the EMT is just to know like who has beds open, what do you have to do to qualify for them, can we take you there right now, does it have to be 3 days, do we have to find you again in 3 days, like it's just that one, that all that knowledge lives with this one caseworker, and whatever calls she goes out on, she can help you navigate to that, but there's so many calls that this one person can't go out on.
And I'm sure like I know that as a fact that like the police will just call Julie Garcia and say, what do we do, where can we go?
Executive director of Jules Helping Hands.
And she will be able to give them the right ideas or help network them, but it's like at that point it's like mutual aid, because it's not something she's necessarily under contract for to do at 2 a.m, but is doing because she wants those people to be in the right spot.
And she has that knowledge probably in her head at all hours, because that's what she has to do to help people find shelter.
You know, I've heard a lot of narrative from some folks on the other side of the political spectrum talking about how people just don't want help and they just don't want services, and like pointing to data from the Spokane Police Department about how, you know, over the summer, nobody that they contacted took them up on offers of service was the big thing that a lot of folks were pointing to during
this
the
is the
election.
camping ban data, right?
The camping ban data. And I guess I was curious, how do you see that narrative, either the interplay between that narrative and this idea that there just isn't a good kind of easy way to navigate people through a system right now?
Yeah, I think that narrative is easy to latch onto if you're looking at the data and you're not looking at the people. Getting to help often means having relationships and building relationships with people who you trust, and you trust that they're going to help you. And when you're coming from trauma and have maybe participated in those systems before and ended up right back in the same spot where you were before, it's that trust building component and that time with somebody, not just like that one moment flash, here you go, you're going to go get help now, isn't this great?
Helper
like
jail.
Yeah, exactly.
Jail, yeah.
Helper, yeah. So our partners in the field find that is not usually the case. Once you establish relationships with people, they are interested in getting help, but they need to it's based on trust, and it's based on beds being available now, beds being available when you're ready, and just like that was a big part of the specialized shelters, is places where people can find that community and get prepared and stabilized to take that next step. Because I mean, I've went to the Trent Center when it was open. That was not a place where you could get stable. Right. I mean, maybe some people could like bootstrap their way out of there with the support of Revive, who had Housing Navigation Center staff there, or who had housing navigators there, but it was wild. Like that was a wild environment. There's not the same kind of like buzz when there's 30 people in the air. Like it's just not as intense.
On the topic of, this might be the last question we get to ask you, and at the risk of touching a third rail topic at the very end here, one of the things we've talked about, the importance of new housing stock. We've talked about the importance of communication. We've talked a little bit about NIMBYism. You mentioned the tiny home village. It sounds like that's going to happen. That was, I think, it sounds like that was one of the things that I remember on the West Plains, all the conversations that were happening around the Catalyst shelter. The other thing people didn't want was that. So what's that conversation been like, and sort of bringing the neighborhood along, or is the appetite for the tiny home village mostly people outside the neighborhood?
Yeah, that'd be the West Hills.
West Hills, yeah.
I mean, there's been a lot of concern.
Yeah.
Every neighborhood is concerned. That neighborhood is specifically concerned because there are other housing, transitional housing models. There's not, and this will not be an emergency shelter too. I think like a lot of it is that like education piece about like what is and what it isn't. It's not like the tiny homes are not going to be a walk-up community where anybody can like go there to have a tiny home for a night.
Yeah.
They will be referral based from the existing system, and that will be something that the city and CAT will be working out.
Okay.
And the city and CAT will be hosting an upcoming public information session, so they're going to be doing more of that like initial outreach.
Right.
We've done some on our own, but we're not really in that role anymore. We're property owners. We have the tiny homes themselves, and we're ready to deploy them. We bought them under contract with the state commerce department. So we're working through what a property owner would work through to put buildings on a site but we're not the service providers. We're not going to be contracting with the service providers. That's CAT Spokane and the city of Spokane from here on out.
And how many units is that going to create, or do you know yet?
It's 30. So we have 15 from the Low Income Housing Institute in Seattle. So those are like stick built houses, and then we have 15 from Pallet Shelter. And because it's a pilot project, part of it is like, what's more efficient? What works better? What do folks like more? So we're really interested in using this as a jumping off point for figuring out, how does this work? Does this work? I mean, we know that we know that they work in cold environments. They have them in Kelowna, British Columbia, and Missoula.
And would you call these transitional housing or permanent supportive housing or permanent housing or something else?
Bridge housing.
New term unlocked at the last possible second. All right, this is Carl Segerstrom, and earlier we heard from Dawn Kinder from the city. This has been Free Range, a co-production of KYRS and Range Media. We'll catch you next week, same time, same place.
Thanks, Carl, and thank you, Dawn, wherever you are.